The warehouse floor felt like it was tilting beneath Mason Clark's steel-toed boots. He gripped the forklift's steering wheel until his knuckles went white, blinking hard to clear the fog that seemed to creep into his vision at the worst possible moments. The headache started as a dull throb behind his left eye, then spread like spilled acid across his skull. "You all right there, Mason?" Tommy Rodriguez called from across the loading dock, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the shipping facility. Mason forced a smile and waved him off. "Just tired, man. Julia's been working doubles at the hospital." But tired didn't explain the way his hands trembled when no one was watching, or how last week he'd forgotten his own address, sitting in his truck, staring at the GPS like it was in another language. The warehouse where Mason had worked 15 years now felt foreign. Towers of medical boxes loomed around him, labels blurring. This job used to make sense back when Owen was still small and late trucks were his biggest problem. Now, at 42, Mason felt like he was drowning in his own skull. "Clark," his supervisor, Big Mike, emerged from the office trailer, clipboard in hand. "Need you to sign off on the morning shipments before you head out." Mason approached the clipboard, pen trembling in his grip. The letters swam on the page like tadpoles. He squinted, trying to focus, but the harder he concentrated, the worse it got. "You sure you're okay?" Mike's weathered face creased with concern. "You look like hell, buddy." "I'm fine." The lie came automatically. "Just need to get home, get some rest." But home wasn't rest anymore. Home was Julia's concerned frown and her father Walter's knowing looks. Home was the nightly ritual of herbal tea that Julia insisted would help with his stress headaches. Home was pretending everything was normal while his brain felt like it was slowly dissolving. The drive home through the Pittsburgh suburbs passed in a haze. Mason's hands gripped the steering wheel of his pickup truck, knuckles white against the black plastic. Every traffic light seemed to take forever to register in his vision. When he finally pulled into the driveway of their modest two-story house, he sat for a moment, collecting himself. Julia's Honda was already there, which meant she'd gotten off her shift at Pittsburgh General early. Through the kitchen window, he could see her moving around, preparing something. Always preparing something. Owen's bicycle lay abandoned on the front lawn, training wheels still attached, even though the kid was 8 now. Mason made a mental note to finally take them off this weekend, assuming he could remember how to use a wrench. The front door opened before he could reach for his keys. Julia Clark stood in the doorway, still wearing her blue scrubs, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. At 40, she still turned heads, but lately, Mason noticed something different in her green eyes. Something calculating. "You look terrible," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Headache again?" Mason nodded, not trusting his voice. The familiar smell of their home, coffee, clean laundry, whatever Julia was cooking, should have been comforting. Instead, it felt suffocating. "Dad's in the kitchen," Julia continued, leading him toward the back of the house. "He brought more of that tea blend, the one that's been helping you sleep." Walter Godwin sat at their kitchen table, a man who looked like he'd spent his 62 years wrestling with dangerous chemicals and winning. His hands, scarred from decades as a supervisor at the agrochemical plant, carefully measured dried herbs from several small containers into a cheesecloth pouch. "Mason." Walter's voice boomed with false cheer. "Just in time. I've got a fresh batch of the mixture ready. This one's got some new ingredients I think will really help with those headaches." "What kind of ingredients?" Mason asked, settling heavily into a chair. The simple act of sitting sent relief flooding through his aching body. "Oh, you know," Walter waved a dismissive hand. "Chamomile, valerian root, some other natural stuff. My grandfather taught me about herbs back when doctors didn't know their A from their elbow." Julia laughed, but it sounded forced to Mason's ears. "Dad's being modest. He practically has a degree in biochemistry from all those years at the plant." "Different kind of chemistry," Walter said, his pale blue eyes fixed on Mason. "But yeah, I know my way around compounds. This stuff will help you relax, guaranteed." Mason watched Walter seal the tea pouch, noting how the old man's movements were precise, clinical, like he was preparing medicine or something else. "Where's Owen?" Mason asked. "Upstairs doing homework," Julia replied, already moving to put the kettle on. "I told him we'd have dinner after you got settled." The routine was always the same. Mason would sit at the kitchen table while Julia prepared his tea. Walter would make small talk about the weather, the neighbors, anything except why Mason's health had been deteriorating for months. Then Owen would bound downstairs, full of 8-year-old energy, and they'd have dinner like a normal family. Except nothing felt normal anymore. You know, Walter said, settling back in his chair. I've been thinking about your symptoms, headaches, vision problems, mood swings. Sounds like stress to me. Classic case of a man pushing himself too hard. Maybe, Mason replied, though something about Walter's tone set off alarm bells in his foggy brain. I've seen it before, Walter continued. Men your age, family responsibilities, job pressure. Sometimes the body just starts breaking down. But this tea should help level you out. The kettle whistled. Julia poured the steaming water over the herb pouch, and the familiar bitter smell filled the kitchen. Mason had grown to hate that smell over the past months, though he couldn't articulate why. Drink up, Julia said, setting the mug in front of him. I'll start dinner. Mason stared at the murky brown liquid. Steam rose from the surface, carrying that medicinal scent that always made his stomach turn. But Julia was watching him with those green eyes, and Walter was pretending to read a magazine while obviously paying attention to every move Mason made. He lifted the mug and took a sip. The tea was bitter, with an underlying metallic taste that he'd learned to tolerate. Within minutes, he felt the familiar drowsiness creeping in, like a warm blanket being pulled over his thoughts. Better? Julia asked. Yeah, Mason mumbled, already feeling his eyelids grow heavy. Much better. But as sleep began to claim him, sitting right there at the kitchen table, a tiny voice in the back of his mind whispered that something was very, very wrong. The next few days blurred together in a haze of headaches and confusion. Mason found himself making mistakes at work, simple errors that he'd never made before. He signed the wrong delivery forms, forgot entire conversations, and once spent 20 minutes looking for his truck keys while they were in his hand. His coworkers started exchanging worried glances. Big Mike pulled him aside on Thursday afternoon. Look, Mason, I like you. You've been solid for 15 years, but whatever's going on with you, it's getting worse. Maybe you should see a doctor. I'm fine, Mason insisted, but the words came out slurred like he'd been drinking. You're not fine, Mike said firmly. Take tomorrow off. Get checked out. That's not a request. Mason wanted to argue, but the effort seemed too overwhelming. The drive home that afternoon was a nightmare of near misses and forgotten stop signs. By the time he pulled into his driveway, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely turn off the engine. Julia was waiting for him, concern etched across her face. But behind the concern, Mason thought he detected something else. Relief. Bad day? She asked. Mike wants me to see a doctor, Mason said, leaning heavily against the kitchen counter. Maybe that's not a bad idea, Julia replied, already reaching for the tea supplies. Dad's coming over tonight with a stronger blend. He thinks you might need something more potent. That night, Mason lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Julia slept beside him. The tea had hit him harder than usual, leaving him drowsy but strangely alert. His body felt disconnected from his brain, like he was watching himself from a distance. Through the thin walls, he could hear Julia's phone buzzing with text messages. The sound repeated every few minutes, but Julia didn't stir. Finally, curiosity overcame the pill-induced lethargy, and Mason forced himself to sit up. Julia's phone lay on her nightstand, screen lighting up with each incoming message. Mason reached over carefully, trying not to wake her, and tilted the screen toward him. The messages were from someone named Jason. How's the progress? Timeline still on track? Remember, gradual decline, nothing sudden. Can't wait to start our new life. Mason felt the cold crawl through his veins. His vision, already compromised by whatever was in the tea, seemed to sharpen with adrenaline. He scrolled up through the message history, his heart pounding so hard he was sure Julia would wake up. Mason's getting worse. Memory issues, coordination problems. Perfect. How much longer? Dad thinks maybe 6 more months. Then we can move forward. I love you, babe. This will all be worth it. Mason's hands began to shake violently. He set the phone back exactly where he'd found it and lay back down, mind racing despite the chemicals coursing through his system. His wife was poisoning him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. All those months of unexplained symptoms, the decline in his health, the way Julia always insisted he drink the tea but never touched it herself. Walter's expertise with chemicals. The strange metallic taste he'd learned to ignore. They were slowly destroying his brain, and someone named Jason was involved. Mason lay perfectly still, listening to Julia's steady breathing, planning his next move. The fog in his head was lifting, replaced by a clarity he hadn't felt in months. Cold, calculating clarity. He would pretend nothing had changed. He would continue drinking the tea, acting sick, playing the part of the confused husband. But now he would be watching, documenting, preparing. Because if Julia thought she could eliminate him quietly, she was about to learn that Mason Clark was much more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The next morning, Mason forced himself to stumble downstairs like usual, rubbing his temples and complaining about his headache. Julia bustled around the kitchen, preparing breakfast and his morning tea with what he now recognized as barely concealed excitement. "How are you feeling, honey?" she asked, setting the steaming mug in front of him. "Terrible," Mason replied truthfully. "I think I should see that doctor today." Julia's hand paused for just a fraction of a second as she reached for the orange juice. "Of course, whatever you think is best." But Mason caught the flash of panic in her eyes. If he went to a doctor, if they ran tests, if they found traces of whatever Walter was putting in that tea— "Actually," Mason said, as if the thought had just occurred to him, "maybe I'll wait until Monday, see if I feel better over the weekend." Julia's relief was palpable. "That sounds smart. Sometimes these things just need time to work themselves out." Mason nodded and took a long sip of the poisoned tea, already planning how he would save a sample for testing, how he would document everything, how he would destroy the people who thought they could erase him from his own life. The war had begun, and Julia had no idea she'd already lost. Mason drove to the emergency clinic on Monday morning, but not for the reasons Julia expected. While she thought he was finally seeking help for his mysterious symptoms, Mason was actually beginning the most important investigation of his life. Dr. Sarah Kim at the urgent care facility was thorough and concerned. Mason's pressure was elevated, his coordination was obviously impaired, and the tremor in his hands was impossible to hide. "I'd like to run some tests," Dr. Kim said, pulling up a chair across from Mason in the small examination room. "Your symptoms could indicate several different conditions. Have you been exposed to any chemicals at work, any new medications, anything unusual in your diet?" Mason hesitated, then made a decision that would change everything. "My wife has been giving me herbal tea for the headaches. Her father makes it." "Herbal tea?" Dr. Kim's eyebrows raised slightly. "Do you know what herbs specifically?" "No," Mason lied. "But I brought a sample." He pulled out a small plastic bag containing tea leaves he'd carefully collected from the kitchen that morning, while Julia was in the shower. Dr. Kim examined the mixture, noting its unusual color and smell. "I'd like to send this to our lab for analysis," she said. "And I want to order a comprehensive blood panel, including heavy metals and toxicology screening." "How long will that take?" "The blood work should be back in a few days. The herbal analysis might take longer, depending on what we find." Mason left the clinic with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. While he waited for the results, he began his own investigation. That afternoon, he stopped at an electronics store and purchased a small digital recorder, a hidden camera system, and a device that would allow him to mirror Julia's phone to his laptop. The technical setup took him most of the weekend, but Mason had always been good with his hands. He installed tiny cameras in the kitchen, bedroom, and garage, positioning them to capture Julia's activities without being obvious. The phone mirroring required him to briefly access Julia's device while she was in the shower, but he managed to install the necessary software without detection. Within 48 hours, Mason was watching his wife's every move and reading her every message. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Julia's affair with Jason Kell had been going on for over a year. Jason was 35, athletic, and worked as a biotech supply representative for companies throughout Pennsylvania. His territory included Walter's former employer, Apex Agricultural Solutions, where he had access to industrial chemicals that weren't available to the general public. The text messages between Julia and Jason revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond a simple affair. They were systematically poisoning Mason with a compound designed to cause neurological deterioration, making it appear as though he was suffering from early-onset dementia or a degenerative brain disease. "Latest shipment arrived today," Jason had texted 3 days earlier. "Walter says this batch is more concentrated. Should accelerate the timeline." Julia's response chilled Mason to the bone. "Good. I'm tired of waiting." "Mason's starting to get suspicious about the tea. We need to finish this before he figures anything out." "Don't worry, babe. 6 more months and he'll be declared mentally incompetent. Then you get full custody of Owen and control of his assets. After that, we disappear." "What about life insurance?" "That comes later. Once he's completely incapacitated, accidents happen, especially to people with severe neurological conditions." Mason saved every message, every photo, every piece of evidence. He cross-referenced Jason's work schedule with the timing of his worst symptoms and found a perfect correlation. Every time Jason made a delivery to Walter, Mason's condition deteriorated significantly within 24 hours. But the most damning evidence came from the hidden camera in the kitchen. Mason watched the footage from the previous Tuesday night when Julia thought he was asleep upstairs. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, pulling out Walter's tea supplies and a small unmarked vial from behind the spice rack. The vial contained a yellowish powder that she measured carefully with a tiny spoon before mixing it into Mason's nightly tea blend. Her face showed no emotion as she stirred the poison into his drink. No guilt, no hesitation, just cold calculation. On Thursday, Dr. Kim called with the preliminary results. "Mason, I need you to come in immediately," she said, her voice tight with concern. "And I think you should bring someone with you, a family member or close friend." "What did you find?" "I'd rather discuss this in person. Can you be here in an hour?" Mason sat in Dr. Kim's office an hour later, alone despite her suggestion. He couldn't risk bringing Julia, and he didn't trust anyone else with what he suspected he was about to learn. "Your blood work shows elevated levels of several concerning compounds," Dr. Kim began, her expression grave. "Most significantly, we found traces of organophosphate derivatives, chemicals typically used in industrial applications, not medical treatments." "What does that mean?" "Organophosphates are neurotoxins. They interfere with nerve function and can cause exactly the symptoms you've been experiencing: headaches, vision problems, memory loss, coordination issues, mood swings. In high enough concentrations or with prolonged exposure, they can cause permanent brain damage." Mason felt a chill run down his spine. "How long would someone have to be exposed to cause the symptoms I'm having?" "Based on the levels in your blood, I'd estimate you've been ingesting small amounts regularly for at least 6 to 8 months. The good news is that if we stop the exposure now, many of the symptoms should improve over time. The bad news is that whoever has been giving you this compound knows exactly what they're doing. This isn't accidental." "Are you saying someone is deliberately poisoning me?" Dr. Kim's expression was serious but compassionate. "I'm saying that organophosphate derivatives don't occur naturally in herbal tea. Someone with access to industrial chemicals has been adding them to whatever you've been drinking." Mason thanked Dr. Kim and left the clinic with copies of all his test results. As he sat in his truck in the parking lot, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: clarity. The fog in his brain was lifting as his body began to metabolize the toxins, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he could think clearly. Julia, Walter, and Jason had made a critical mistake. They'd assumed that by slowly destroying his mind, they could eliminate him without anyone noticing. But they hadn't counted on Mason being smart enough to seek help, and they certainly hadn't expected him to fight back. That evening, Mason returned home and played his part perfectly. He stumbled through the front door, complained about his headache, and gratefully accepted the tea Julia prepared for him. But instead of drinking it, he used a technique he'd learned online to palm the liquid and dispose of it in the sink when she wasn't looking. Over the next week, as the toxins gradually left his system, Mason's condition improved dramatically. He was careful to hide his recovery, continuing to act confused and disoriented whenever Julia or Walter were around. But privately, he was sharper than he'd been in months. The hidden cameras revealed more damning evidence. Walter visited 3 times that week, each time bringing new supplies and discussing dosage adjustments with Julia. Jason appeared twice, once bringing a new vial of the yellowish powder, and once to have what appeared to be a strategy session with Julia in the garage, while Mason was supposedly sleeping. "He's not declining fast enough," Jason said during one recorded conversation. "We need to increase the concentration." "Dad's worried about making it too obvious," Julia replied. "If Mason dies suddenly, there will be an autopsy. Then we stick to the plan. Keep him confused and sick until we can get the competency hearing. Once you have legal control, we can accelerate things." "I hate waiting," Julia said, and Mason could hear the frustration in her voice through the surveillance audio. "I'm tired of pretending to care about him. I'm tired of this house, this life, everything. Soon, babe. Soon we'll be in Florida with new identities and Mason's money. Just a few more months." Mason saved every recording, every message, every piece of evidence. He consulted with a private investigator who specialized in domestic crimes, learning about chain of custody, admissible evidence, and how to build a case that would stand up in court. But most importantly, he began planning his revenge, because Julia, Walter, and Jason had made one fatal error. They'd underestimated exactly how dangerous Mason Clark could be when someone threatened his family. Mason's recovery accelerated once he stopped ingesting the toxins, but he was careful to hide his improvement from his would-be executioners. Playing the role of a confused, deteriorating man was easier than he'd expected. He simply had to remember how he'd felt during the worst days of his poisoning. The hardest part was protecting Owen without arousing suspicion. His 8-year-old son had been living with the stress of watching his father's apparent decline for months. Owen's grades had dropped. He'd become withdrawn at school, and Mason often caught him staring with worried eyes during dinner. The boy was too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to know something was terribly wrong. "Dad?" Owen approached him one evening while Mason was pretending to struggle with reading the newspaper. "Are you going to get better?" The question hit Mason like a physical blow. He looked at his son. Sandy hair messed from playing outside, gap-toothed smile uncertain, and felt his resolve harden into something unbreakable. "I'm going to be fine, buddy," Mason said, pulling Owen onto his lap. "Don't worry about me, okay?" "Mom says you might have to go to a special hospital," Owen whispered, as if sharing a secret. "What else does Mom say?" Mason asked gently, though inside he was seething. "She says sometimes daddies get sick in their brains and they can't take care of their families anymore. She says if that happens, Grandpa Walter and her friend Jason will help take care of us." Mason's blood turned to ice. Julia was already preparing Owen for his removal from the family. She was conditioning their son to accept Mason's disappearance as inevitable, even necessary. "Owen," Mason said carefully, "if anything ever happens to me, I want you to remember something, no matter what anyone tells you. I love you more than anything in the world, and I would never, ever leave you unless someone forced me to. Do you understand?" Owen nodded solemnly, though Mason could see confusion in the boy's eyes. That night, after Owen was asleep and Julia was working a late shift at the hospital, Mason made a series of phone calls that would change everything. First, he called attorney David Morrison, a criminal defense lawyer who'd been recommended by the private investigator. Morrison specialized in domestic misuse cases and had experience with poisoning cases. "I need to see you tomorrow," Mason told him. "I have documentation of an ongoing conspiracy to incapacitate me, and I believe my life is in immediate danger." "How immediate?" Morrison asked. "They've been poisoning me for 8 months. Based on their communications, they were planning to escalate soon." "Bring everything you have. Documents, recordings, medical records. If this is what you think it is, we need to involve law enforcement immediately." Mason's second call was to Detective Rachel Voss at the Pennsylvania State Police. The private investigator had recommended her as someone who took domestic violence cases seriously and had experience with complex evidence. "Detective Voss, my name is Mason Clark, and I need to report an ongoing conspiracy to commit aggravated attack and attempted elimination. I have video evidence, text messages, medical records, and recorded conversations." "How long has this been going on, Mr. Clark?" 8 months of systematic poisoning. I have proof that my wife, her father, and her lover have been adding industrial neurotoxins to my food and drink with the intent to incapacitate me and gain control of my assets." There was a long pause. "Mr. Clark, these are very serious allegations. Are you in immediate danger?" "I believe so. Based on their communications, they're planning to escalate their efforts because the current approach isn't working fast enough. I can meet with you tomorrow morning. Bring everything you have, and don't consume anything prepared by the people you suspect. Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" "I'm at home, but I'll be careful." Mason's third call was to his brother Jake in California. "I need you to listen to me very carefully," Mason told him. "If something happens to me in the next few weeks, I want you to know it wasn't an accident. Julia, her father Walter, and a man named Jason Kell have been poisoning me." "Jesus, Mason, are you serious?" "Dead serious. I'm meeting with police and a lawyer tomorrow, but if they succeed in eliminating me before I can stop them, I need someone to know the truth. Someone who will fight for Owen. I'll be on the next plane." "No, not yet. If you show up suddenly, they might panic and do something desperate. But be ready. If I call you and say the project is complete, it means they've made their move and you need to get here immediately." Mason spent the rest of the night organizing his evidence into a comprehensive file. Photos of the poison vials, audio recordings of the conspiracy discussions, video footage of Julia preparing the contaminated tea, text messages between the conspirators, medical records showing the poisoning, and financial documents that revealed Jason's access to the industrial chemicals through his biotech company. By dawn, he had assembled a case that would be impossible to dismiss. But Mason wasn't satisfied with just sending them to prison. He wanted them to experience the same fear, confusion, and helplessness they'd inflicted on him. He wanted them to understand what it felt like to watch their carefully constructed world collapse around them. So he began to plan. Over the next week, Mason implemented a strategy designed to create maximum psychological pressure on his would-be executioners. He started by making subtle changes to their routine that would create doubt and paranoia. He began leaving evidence that he was more aware than he appeared. When Julia left her phone unattended, he moved it slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough that she would notice and wonder if she'd placed it differently. He repositioned items in Walter's garage workshop when the old man wasn't there, creating the impression that someone had been searching through his chemical supplies. Most effectively, he began dropping hints that suggested his memory wasn't as compromised as they believed. "Julia," he said one morning over breakfast, "who's Jason?" Julia froze, coffee mug halfway to her lips. "What do you mean?" "I keep having dreams about someone named Jason. Tall guy, athletic. He's in our house for some reason." "I don't know any Jason," Julia said quickly, but Mason could see panic flickering in her eyes. "Weird," Mason said, taking a sip of the tea he wasn't actually drinking. "Maybe it's just the headaches affecting my dreams." Later that day, he called Julia's hospital and left a message with her supervisor. "This is Mason Clark, Julia's husband. Could you ask her to call home when she gets a chance? I'm having trouble remembering some things, and I need to ask her about a man named Jason who's been coming to our house." The message was guaranteed to reach Julia within hours, and it would plant the seed that Mason was becoming suspicious about her lover. With Walter, Mason's approach was more direct. He visited the old man's house under the pretense of feeling confused and needing guidance. "Walter," he said, sitting in the old man's living room, "I've been thinking about the tea you make for me. What exactly is in it?" "Just herbs, son, natural stuff to help you relax." "See, that's what's confusing me," Mason continued, affecting a puzzled expression. "I've been reading about herbs online, and some of the effects I'm having don't match what chamomile and valerian are supposed to do." Walter's face remained impassive, but Mason noticed his hands clenched slightly. "Well, there are other ingredients, traditional remedies passed down in my family." "Could you write them down for me? I want to show my doctor. She's been asking a lot of questions about anything unusual I might be taking." "You're seeing a doctor?" Walter's voice sharpened. "Oh yeah," Julia insisted. "She's worried about my headaches. The doctor wants to run some tests, check my blood for anything unusual." Mason watched Walter's face go pale. "Tests? What kind of tests?" "Blood work, I think. Something about checking for toxins or chemicals. The doctor said my symptoms could be caused by exposure to industrial compounds." "Industrial compounds?" Walter's voice was strained now. "Yeah, weird, right? Who would have access to that kind of stuff?" Mason gave Walter a meaningful look. "The doctor said it would be someone with a background in chemistry or agriculture." That night, Mason's surveillance cameras captured Walter frantically making phone calls and destroying documents in his garage. Julia received a flurry of panicked text messages. "Mason's been to a doctor. They're running blood tests. He's asking questions about the tea. We need to accelerate the timeline." Jason's response was immediate. "How much does he know?" "Can't tell. He seems confused, but he's asking the right questions." "Maybe we should back off for a while." "No." Julia's typed response was vehement. "We're too close to stop now. If he's getting suspicious, we need to finish this before he can cause problems." "What are you suggesting?" "One final dose, enough to cause a stroke or heart attack. Make it look natural." "That's too risky. If they're already running tests, then we make sure there's no one left to interpret the results." Mason saved every message, every recorded conversation, every piece of evidence. The conspirators were panicking, making mistakes, leaving a trail that would be impossible to explain away in court. But their willingness to escalate to lethal violence meant Mason had to move quickly. He called Detective Voss and arranged to turn over all his evidence the following day. He contacted his lawyer and scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss protective measures for himself and Owen. And he called his brother Jake with a simple message. "Get ready to travel. The project is almost complete." Because Mason had decided that Julia, Walter, and Jason had committed their last crime. Tomorrow, their carefully constructed conspiracy would collapse, and they would learn what it felt like to be truly helpless. But first, Mason had one final performance to give. He needed to convince them that their plan was working, that he was too confused and disoriented to be a threat. It would be the most important acting job of his life. Mason's performance that evening was Oscar-worthy. When Julia returned from her hospital shift, she found him slumped at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a newspaper he was holding upside down. "Mason?" she approached cautiously. "Are you all right?" He looked up at her with unfocused eyes, blinking slowly as if trying to remember who she was. "Julia? When did you get home?" "Just now. I've only been gone for 8 hours." She studied his face carefully. "You seem worse tonight." "Worse?" Mason frowned, genuinely confused by the concept. I can't remember eating dinner. Did I eat dinner?" Julia's relief was visible. Whatever suspicions had been building, they were being overwhelmed by the apparent acceleration of his decline. "No, honey, you haven't eaten yet. Let me make you something." "Could you make the tea first?" Mason asked. "My head is really hurting." As Julia prepared his nightly dose of poison, Mason fought to maintain his confused demeanor while internally cataloging every detail for the investigators. The way she measured the powder with clinical precision, the practiced efficiency of her movements, the complete absence of guilt or hesitation as she stirred neurotoxins into her husband's drink. "Here you go," she said, setting the steaming mug in front of him. "This should help." Mason made a show of drinking deeply, using sleight of hand to dispose of most of the liquid while making satisfied noises. Within minutes, he allowed his eyelids to droop and his head to nod forward. "I'm so tired," he mumbled. "Why don't you go to bed early tonight?" Julia suggested, her voice gentle but her eyes calculating. "I'll bring Owen up to say goodnight." Mason shuffled upstairs like a man whose brain was shutting down. But once in his bedroom, with the door closed, he moved with purpose. He activated his recording equipment, ensured his phone was set to capture everything, and prepared for what he suspected would be a very revealing evening. Owen came upstairs for their nightly ritual, but tonight the 8-year-old seemed unusually clingy. "Dad, I don't want you to be sick anymore," Owen whispered as Mason tucked him into bed. "I know, buddy. It's going to be okay. Mom says you might have to go away to get better, to a place where they take care of people with brain problems." Mason felt his heart break. "Owen, look at me. No matter what happens, no matter what anyone tells you, I will never willingly leave you, ever. If I go away, it's because someone is making me go away. Do you understand?" Owen nodded, tears forming in his young eyes. "If that happens, I want you to call Uncle Jake immediately. Can you remember his phone number?" Mason made Owen repeat Jake's number 3 times, then hugged his son tightly. "I love you more than anything in the world. Remember that." An hour later, Mason's surveillance equipment captured Julia making a phone call from the kitchen. "It's working," she told someone, presumably Jason. "He's much worse tonight. Couldn't even remember if he'd eaten dinner." "Good. How much longer do you think?" "Dad thinks maybe 2 more weeks at this concentration, but I'm getting impatient." "Don't rush it. We're too close to screw up now." "I know, but living this lie is making me crazy." Pretending to care about him, acting like the concerned wife. "I hate touching him. I hate the way he looks at me like I'm his savior when you're actually eliminating him," Jason finished. "I know, babe, but think about the payoff. Mason's life insurance alone is worth $500,000, plus his savings, the house, his pension. And once we get Owen, we'll have access to his trust fund too." "What about Owen? I mean, after..." "Kids are adaptable. He'll adjust to his new reality. And if he doesn't..." Jason's voice turned cold. "Well, accidents happen to children too." Mason's hands clenched into fists. They weren't just planning to eliminate him, they were considering injuring Owen, his 8-year-old son, whose only crime was having a mother who'd traded her soul for money and lust. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Julia and Jason discussing their post-elimination plans in detail. They had fake identities prepared, a house rented in Florida, and a timeline that would have them disappearing within 6 months of Mason's passing. But the most damning evidence came when Walter arrived an hour later. The 3 conspirators gathered in the garage, speaking in low voices that Mason's professional-grade surveillance equipment captured perfectly. "The blood tests are a problem," Walter said without preamble. "If they find traces of the compound, they'll start asking questions." "How long before the tests come back?" Jason asked. "Could be any day now," Julia replied. "Mason said the doctor wanted comprehensive toxicology screening." "Then we accelerate." Walter said firmly. I've prepared a final mixture. One dose will cause massive neurological trauma, heart attack, stroke, complete organ failure. By the time any doctor examines him, it'll look like his brain just shut down. How final? Julia asked. Dead within 6 hours, Walter said matter-of-factly. No chance of recovery, no possibility of testimony. Clean and permanent. Mason felt ice water flow through his veins. They were planning to eliminate him tomorrow night. What about the investigation? Jason asked. If he dies right after getting blood tests. Tragic, but not suspicious, Walter explained. Man in his 40s, under stress, declining health, sudden cardiac event brought on by neurological complications. Happens all the time. And the compound? Julia asked. Metabolizes quickly. By the time they autopsy him, it'll be undetectable. All they'll find is a brain riddled with lesions consistent with rapid onset dementia. I can't wait, Julia said, and Mason could hear the anticipation in her voice. I'm so tired of pretending. Tomorrow night, this nightmare finally ends. Mason had heard enough. He quietly gathered his recording equipment and prepared for the most important phone call of his life. At 2 a.m., he called Detective Voss. Detective, this is Mason Clark. They're planning to finish me tomorrow night. I have recordings of them discussing a final lethal dose. I need police protection immediately. Mr. Clark, are you in immediate danger right now? I think so. They have the poison prepared. If they get spooked, they might act tonight. I'm sending units to your location. Stay on the line with me, lock yourself in a room, and don't consume anything. We're 20 minutes out. Mason barricaded himself in his bedroom, phone in hand, listening to Julia moving around downstairs. Every sound made him wonder if she was coming upstairs with a syringe or a piece or some other method of ensuring his silence. But Julia never came. She was apparently confident that Mason was too sedated to be aware of anything happening around him. 23 minutes later, Mason heard vehicles pulling into his driveway. No sirens, no dramatic announcements, just the quiet efficiency of law enforcement professionals executing a carefully planned operation. Detective Voss called his cell phone. Mr. Clark, we're outside. Can you come down and let us in quietly? We don't want to alert the suspects if they're still on the property. Mason crept downstairs and opened the front door to find Detective Voss and 3 other officers waiting. Voss was a compact woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Where are they? She asked quietly. Julia's asleep upstairs. Walter went home around midnight. Jason doesn't live here, but he's been coming by regularly. We're going to need you to come with us, Voss said. We'll take your statement and then decide how to proceed. Is your son in the house? Yes, he's asleep. He doesn't know anything about this. We'll arrange for Child Protective Services to ensure his safety while we investigate. As they spoke, more vehicles arrived. Crime scene technicians, additional detectives, and what appeared to be federal agents. Mason realized that his case had grown beyond simple domestic attack. Federal involvement? He asked Voss. Industrial neurotoxins cross state lines, which makes this a federal case. Plus, if Jason Kell has been stealing controlled substances from his employer, that's federal jurisdiction. Over the next 6 hours, Mason gave the most comprehensive statement of his life. He handed over dozens of audio recordings, hundreds of text messages, video footage of Julia preparing poisoned tea, medical records documenting his systematic poisoning, and financial documents showing Jason's access to the chemicals used in the conspiracy. By morning, warrants had been issued for Julia Clark, Walter Godwin, and Jason Kell. The arrests began at 6 a.m. Julia was taken into custody at the hospital, handcuffed in front of her colleagues as she arrived for her morning shift. The charges read to her included conspiracy to commit first-degree elimination, aggravated attack, reckless endangerment, and child endangerment. Walter was arrested at his home, where a search revealed a sophisticated laboratory setup in his basement and garage. Federal agents found industrial chemicals, mixing equipment, detailed notes on dosage calculations, and correspondence with Jason Kell about chemical procurement. Jason proved more elusive. When agents arrived at his apartment, they found evidence that he'd left hurriedly, clothes scattered, computer missing, and a kitchen garbage can filled with documents that had been hastily shredded. But Jason had underestimated federal law enforcement capabilities. His car was spotted 6 hours later at a gas station near the Ohio border. When agents moved in to arrest him, Jason made a run for it. The chase was brief, but violent. Jason crashed his car into a guardrail while trying to evade arrest, then attempted to flee on foot through a wooded area. When cornered, he pulled a piece and fired at the pursuing agents. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, Jason Kell was dead, and the conspiracy was decapitated. But for Mason, the real satisfaction came that evening when he visited Julia in the county jail. She sat across from him in the visiting room, orange jumpsuit replacing her nursing scrubs, hands cuffed to a chain around her waist. The confident, calculating woman who'd been slowly eliminating her husband was gone, replaced by someone who looked broken and desperate. "Mason," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I can explain everything. It wasn't my idea. Walter forced me into it. Jason threatened Owen if I didn't cooperate." Mason stared at her for a long moment, remembering all the nights she'd handed him poisoned tea with a smile, all the times she'd pretended to comfort him, while actively destroying his brain, all the conversations he'd recorded where she'd laughed about his deteriorating condition. "Do you remember what you said to Jason 3 nights ago?" Mason asked quietly. "About how you hated touching me? How you hated pretending to care about me?" Julia's face went white. "You heard that?" "I heard everything, Julia. Every conversation, every text message, every plan you made to eliminate me and steal my life." "Mason, please. I also heard you discussing what would happen to Owen if he didn't adjust to his new reality." Mason's voice turned to ice. "You were planning to hurt our son." "No, that was Jason talking, not me. You didn't stop him. You didn't object. You agreed to it." Julia broke down completely, sobbing and pleading, but Mason felt nothing. No pity, no anger, no satisfaction, just cold certainty that he'd made the right choice. "I hope you understand," he said, standing to leave, "that you're never going to see Owen again. You're never going to touch another patient. You're never going to hurt another person. Your life as you knew it is over." He walked away from his wife of 12 years without looking back. Because Julia Clark, the woman he'd married and trusted and loved, was dead to him. The creature in the orange jumpsuit was just a criminal who'd happened to share his bed while planning his elimination, and criminals belonged in cages. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Julia Clark, Walter Godwin, and the estate of Jason Kell began 8 months later in a Pittsburgh courtroom that was packed with media, law enforcement officials, and members of the medical community who were horrified that one of their own had used her knowledge to systematically poison her husband. District Attorney Margaret Hayes had built her career on complex domestic violence cases, but even she admitted that the evidence in this case was unprecedented. "In 23 years of prosecution," she told reporters, "I've never seen such methodical, calculated cruelty combined with such comprehensive documentation of the crimes." Mason sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, watching the woman who'd tried to eliminate him shuffle into court in leg shackles and an orange jumpsuit. Julia had lost weight during her months in custody, and her auburn hair had grown out to show gray roots. She looked nothing like the confident nurse who'd once commanded respect in the emergency room. Walter sat beside her, his 62-year-old frame diminished by the Orange County Jail uniform. The man who'd spent decades working with dangerous chemicals now looked like what he was, a frightened old man facing the possibility of dying in prison. Defense attorney Robert Chen had taken Julia's case pro bono, apparently believing that her claims of coercion and manipulation might generate sympathy from a jury. He was about to learn how wrong he could be. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," D.A. Hayes began her opening statement, "over the next 2 weeks, you're going to hear evidence of a conspiracy so calculated, so cruel, and so coldly executed that it will challenge your faith in human nature." Hayes walked slowly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each of the 12 jurors who would decide Julia and Walter's fate. The defendants didn't use a Colt or a knife to attack Mason Clark. They used something far more insidious, his trust. For 8 months, Julia Clark handed her husband a cup of tea every night, knowing that cup contained industrial neurotoxins designed to slowly destroy his brain. Hayes paused, letting that sink in. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment. This was a systematic, methodical campaign to eliminate Mason Clark while making it appear that he was suffering from natural causes, and they almost succeeded. The prosecutor clicked a remote, and the courtroom's large display screen showed a photo of Mason during his worst days, pale, confused, visibly trembling as he tried to sign a document at work. This is what Mason Clark looked like after 6 months of being poisoned by the people he trusted most. His coordination was deteriorating, his memory was failing, and his ability to care for his 8-year-old son was disappearing. In a few more months, he would have been declared mentally incompetent. Shortly after that, according to the defendant's own recorded statements, he would have suffered a fatal accident. Hayes spent the next hour methodically outlining the evidence. Hundreds of text messages between the conspirators, audio recordings of them discussing dosages and timelines, video footage of Julia preparing poison tea, medical records showing systematic poisoning, and financial documents revealing the motive. The evidence will show that Julia Clark, Walter Godwin, and Jason Kell, who died while resisting arrest, planned to steal Mason Clark's life, his assets, and his son. They were willing to commit elimination to achieve their goals, and they came within days of succeeding. Defense attorney Chen's opening statement was a masterpiece of misdirection and sufferer blaming that might have worked in a different case with different evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, my client Julia Clark is not a criminal mastermind. She's a sufferer, a woman who was manipulated and coerced by her domineering father and an abusive lover into participating in a scheme she never fully understood. Chen painted a picture of Julia as a naive woman caught between a father who'd controlled her since childhood and a lover who'd threatened her and her son if she didn't cooperate. Walter Godwin spent 40 years working with dangerous chemicals. He knew exactly what compounds would cause the effects seen in Mason Clark. Julia Clark is a nurse, not a chemist. She trusted her father when he told her the tea would help her husband's stress and headaches. But Chen's strategy began to crumble the moment D.A. Hayes called her first witness. Dr. Sarah Kim took the stand with quiet authority, her credentials as an emergency medicine physician and toxicologist establishing her expertise beyond question. Dr. Kim, Hayes began, in your medical opinion, what was the intent of whoever administered these compounds to Mason Clark? Based on the specific chemicals used, the dosage patterns, and the duration of exposure, the intent was clearly to cause progressive neurological deterioration that would eventually result in complete incapacitation. Could these effects have been accidental? Absolutely not. The compounds found in Mr. Clark's system don't occur naturally. They had to be deliberately introduced, and the specific combination suggests someone with extensive knowledge of neurotoxins. In your opinion, if the poisoning had continued, what would have been the eventual outcome? Doctor. Kim's voice was steady but grim. Mr. Clark would have suffered complete neurological failure within 3 to 6 months. The damage would have been irreversible. An end would have been inevitable. Chen's cross-examination focused on the possibility that Julia might not have understood the true nature of what she was giving her husband. Dr. Kim, is it possible that someone could administer these compounds without understanding their lethal nature? The compounds themselves require specialized knowledge to obtain and handle safely. Additionally, the careful dosage regulation we see in this case suggests ongoing monitoring of the sufferer's condition to ensure optimal effect. But could a layperson be fooled into thinking they were administering harmless herbal remedies? Doctor. Kim paused thoughtfully. The compounds have a distinctive metallic odor and bitter taste. Anyone regularly handling them would notice these characteristics. Additionally, the careful measurement required for effective dosing suggests knowledge of their potency. Hayes's next witness was Detective Rachel Voss, who walked the jury through the investigation with methodical precision. Detective Voss, Hayes asked, what was your first impression when Mr. Clark contacted you? Mr. Clark was clearly in fear for his life, but he was also remarkably organized. He had documented months of evidence with the thoroughness of someone who understood the legal requirements for prosecution. What convinced you that his allegations were credible? The quality and quantity of evidence. Audio recordings, video footage, text messages, medical records. It was the most comprehensive case file I'd ever seen from a civilian. Voss then guided the jury through the evidence methodically. They heard Julia's recorded voice discussing Mason's progress toward incapacitation. They saw video footage of her carefully measuring poison into his tea. They read text messages where she expressed impatience with the timeline and eagerness to finish this. Detective, Hayes asked, in your opinion, was Julia Clark a willing participant in this conspiracy? Based on the evidence, Mrs. Clark was not only a willing participant, she was often the driving force pushing for escalation. Chen's cross-examination attempted to cast doubt on the recordings and suggest that Julia's statements had been taken out of context. Detective Voss, isn't it possible that these recordings capture only fragments of longer conversations? That crucial context might be missing. Mr. Chen, we have over 40 hours of recorded conversations between the conspirators. The context is quite clear. But couldn't Mrs. Clark have been acting under duress, speaking words she didn't mean to appease her father and Jason Kell? The recordings span 8 months. If Mrs. Clark was acting under duress, she maintained that performance with remarkable consistency. Additionally, many of the most damning statements were made during private conversations with Jason Kell, when her father wasn't present to coerce her. The prosecution's case continued to build with devastating momentum. Owen Clark, now 9 years old, testified about the special tea his mother gave only to his father and how she'd told him that Daddy might have to go away because his brain was sick. Mason's brother Jake testified about the emergency phone call he'd received, describing his brother as terrified but determined to protect his son. Co-workers from the warehouse testified about Mason's declining condition and their growing concern about his ability to perform his job safely. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source: Jason Kell's former colleague at the biotech supply company, Dr. Amanda Rodriguez had worked with Jason for 3 years and had grown suspicious when he began requesting unusual chemicals that weren't part of their normal inventory. Jason started ordering compounds that had no legitimate use in our client base, Dr. Rodriguez testified. When I asked about them, he claimed they were for a special research project, but he couldn't provide documentation. What kind of compounds? Hayes asked. Organophosphate derivatives primarily used in military research and industrial applications. Highly regulated substances that require special permits and handling procedures. Did Mr. Kell have authorization to order these materials? No. He was falsifying requisition forms and forging supervisor signatures. When I reported my concerns to management, they launched an internal investigation. What did that investigation reveal? Jason had been stealing controlled substances for over a year. The company estimated that he'd diverted enough neurotoxic compounds to eliminate dozens of people. Hayes turned to face the jury. Dr. Rodriguez, in your professional opinion, what would someone do with that quantity of stolen neurotoxins? There's only one possible use for those compounds in civilian hands: to cause deliberate neurological damage to human beings. Chen's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Dr. Rodriguez's credentials were impeccable. Her testimony was technical but clear, and her obvious disgust at Jason's actions was palpable. The prosecution rested after 2 weeks of testimony that had systematically destroyed any possible defense. The evidence was so overwhelming that even seasoned court reporters later said they'd never seen such a one-sided case. Chen's defense strategy was desperate and unconvincing. He called character witnesses who testified that Julia had always been a caring mother and dedicated nurse. He presented evidence of Walter's controlling behavior toward his daughter throughout her life. He even suggested that Jason Kell had threatened Owen's safety to force Julia's cooperation. But none of it mattered when faced with Julia's own recorded words expressing satisfaction at Mason's deterioration and eagerness to finish this nightmare. The defense's final witness was Julia herself. She took the stand wearing a conservative blue dress that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had in her jail jumpsuit. Chen had clearly coached her extensively, but Julia's performance was unconvincing from the start. Mrs. Clark, Chen began, did you understand that the tea your father prepared for your husband contained dangerous chemicals? No, Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad told me it was herbs, natural remedies that would help Mason's stress and headaches. Did you want to damage your husband? Of course not. I loved Mason. I was trying to help him. Chen guided Julia through a carefully constructed narrative where she was portrayed as a sufferer of manipulation by 2 dominant men who'd threatened her and her son. According to her testimony, she'd never understood the true nature of the tea, never consented to the conspiracy, and never had any romantic relationship with Jason Kell. But D.A. Hayes' cross-examination was surgical in its precision. Mrs. Clark, you testified that you loved your husband and wanted to help him. Is that correct? Yes. Hayes walked to the prosecution table and picked up a transcript. Mrs. Clark, I'm going to read you something that was recorded in your garage on the night of March 15th. This is your voice speaking to Jason Kell. Hayes read Julia's own words back to her. I hate touching him. I hate the way he looks at me like I'm his savior when I'm actually eliminating him. I can't wait for this to be over. Julia's face went white. That was taken out of context. What context would make those words acceptable, Mrs. Clark? I was upset, stressed. I didn't mean it. Hayes consulted another transcript. 3 days later, you sent a text message to Jason Kell saying, Mason's getting worse. Memory issues, coordination problems. Dad thinks maybe 6 more months. Then we can move forward. What did you mean by move forward, Mrs. Clark? I don't remember sending that. The message was sent from your phone at 2:47 a.m. on March 18th. Phone records confirm it. Hayes continued the methodical destruction of Julia's credibility for another 2 hours. Every claim was contradicted by recorded evidence. Every excuse was proven false by documented facts. The cross-examination's climax came when Hayes played the audio recording of Julia's final conversation with Jason and Walter, where they'd discussed the lethal final dose. The courtroom was silent as Julia's recorded voice filled the air. I can't wait. I'm so tired of pretending. Tomorrow night, this nightmare finally ends. Mrs. Clark, Hayes said quietly. Whose nightmare were you referring to? Julia broke down completely on the witness stand, sobbing and unable to answer. Let me clarify, Hayes continued. Your husband was dying from systematic poisoning, your 8-year-old son was watching his father deteriorate, and you described the situation as your nightmare? Julia's complete collapse on the witness stand effectively ended her defense. Chen called no further witnesses and rested his case that afternoon. Closing arguments were anticlimactic. Hayes summarized the evidence methodically, reminding the jury that Julia's own words had condemned her. Chen made a final plea for mercy based on his client's claimed mental state, but even he seemed to lack conviction. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree elimination, guilty of aggravated attack, guilty of reckless endangerment, guilty of child endangerment. Walter Godwin received identical verdicts. Judge Patricia Williams scheduled sentencing for the following month, but her comments left no doubt about the outcome. In 40 years on the bench, Judge Williams said, I have never encountered such calculated cruelty disguised as familial concern. The defendants didn't just attempt to end Mason Clark's life. They attempted to steal his identity, his sanity, and his relationship with his son while making him complicit in his own destruction. 6 weeks later, Julia Clark was sentenced to 24 years in state prison without possibility of parole for 15 years. Walter Godwin received 20 years, with his advanced age making it unlikely he would ever be released. But for Mason, the real justice had come months earlier, when he'd walked out of that jail visiting room and left his former wife in chains. 2 years after the trial, Mason Clark stood in the kitchen of his new house, watching his 10-year-old son Owen finish his homework at the dining room table. They'd moved across the state to Philadelphia, where Mason had found work at a medical supply company, and Owen was thriving in a new school. The house was smaller than their old place in the Pittsburgh suburbs, but it was theirs, free of poisoned memories and toxic shadows. Owen had legally changed his last name to match Mason's new identity. As far as anyone in their new life knew, they were just a father and son starting fresh after a difficult divorce. Owen looked up from his math worksheet. Dad, can Jake come visit next weekend? He's already planning on it, Mason replied, stirring the pasta sauce for dinner. He wants to take you to that new science museum downtown. Owen grinned. Uncle Jake had become a central figure in their new life, visiting monthly and providing the stable male presence that Owen needed. Jake had also been instrumental in helping Mason navigate the psychological aftermath of his ordeal. The nightmares had stopped months ago. The paranoia about food and drink had faded gradually. The hypervigilance that had kept Mason awake for months after the trial had finally given way to something approaching normal sleep. But the most important healing had been watching Owen recover his childhood joy. Dad, Owen looked up again. Tommy Rodriguez invited me to sleep over Friday night. Can I go? Mason smiled. Owen's social life had exploded since they'd moved to Philadelphia. Without the stress of watching his father's apparent deterioration, the boy had returned to being the outgoing, confident kid he'd been before Julia's conspiracy began. Sure, buddy. Just make sure you pack your toothbrush. The evening routine was simple and peaceful. Dinner together at the table, homework review, an hour of television, then bedtime stories that Mason actually remembered reading. No mysterious headaches, no coordination problems, no brain fog that made simple conversations impossible. Around 8 o'clock, Owen disappeared upstairs to work on a special project for school. Mason was loading the dishwasher when his son came back down, carrying a large piece of poster board. I finished my family tree assignment, Owen announced proudly. Mason dried his hands and examined Owen's artwork. The family tree was colorful and detailed, with careful drawings of each family member. At the base of the tree were 2 figures labeled Dad and Owen Clark. Above them were Grandpa Jake and Uncle Tommy. Owen's name for his father's friend Tommy Rodriguez, who visited regularly. The tree included Mason's parents, who had died years before the conspiracy began, and even the family dog they'd adopted 6 months earlier. But there was no trace of Julia, Walter, or anyone connected to their former life. "This is beautiful," Mason said, and meant it. "Tell me about these people." Owen pointed to each figure excitedly. "That's you and me, obviously, and that's Uncle Jake, who's really my uncle even though he lives in California, and Uncle Tommy, who's teaching me to fix cars, and Grandma and Grandpa Clark, who you said were really nice, even though they died before I was born." "What about your mom?" Mason asked gently. It was a question he'd been dreading, but knew would come eventually. Owen's expression grew serious. "I know I had a mom before, but I don't really remember her very well. And you said she had to go away because she did something really bad." "That's right." "Will she ever come back?" "No, buddy, she won't." Owen nodded solemnly, then brightened. "That's okay. I like our family the way it is now. Just us and Uncle Jake and Uncle Tommy and Buster." He pointed to the small dog figure he'd drawn at the bottom of the tree. Mason felt something release in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for 2 years without realizing it. Owen was going to be okay. The boy had processed his mother's absence, accepted their new reality, and built a family structure based on the people who actually cared about him. "I like our family too," Mason said, wrapping his son in a hug. Later that evening, after Owen was asleep, Mason sat on his back porch with a beer and his phone, reading the weekly email updates from Detective Voss about Julia and Walter's status in prison. Julia had been placed in protective custody after several violent incidents with other inmates. Apparently, prisoners didn't appreciate people who poisoned their families. She'd applied for early release twice and been denied both times. Her earliest possible parole date was still 11 years away. Walter had suffered a stroke 6 months into his sentence and was now in the prison medical facility. At 64, with his health declining rapidly, he was unlikely to survive his full sentence. Mason felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but no sympathy either. They'd made their choices and earned their consequences. His only concern was ensuring they never had the opportunity to hurt anyone else.